Hello and welcome back to Boxset Binge the Bible from Seven Vineyard. My name is Bern, Leckie, and I'm joined today by Owen, Lynch.
Hello, Owen.
And we are going through the Bible at this amazing pace, driving through. Whoa, watch out for that corner. Whoa, going around a huge bend. Wow, there's a lot of stuff over there. Have we got time to look at all this stuff in massive detail? No, we don't.
It's a great sense of momentum, though, isn't it?
It is. And we were just thinking just before we started recording this about how long this episode could be based on all the ideas that came up from looking at the beginning of Exodus. We just read the first couple of dozen chapters really in Exodus. Just so much in there. Oh my goodness. So welcome to this first 9-hour long edition. Get a meal in. No, we'll try and edit it down. I was just struck at the beginning by the difference between where things ended up in Genesis, where you thought, they're settled, they're in a nice place, and the turn it takes into Exodus. And if there's one thing that I would put my finger on as the important reason that the author nails for this change, I would say it's relationship.
How so, Bern? How so? Because
Joseph has this trust and relationship that he's built up with the Egyptians, and he's well regarded and he's done great things for them. And so when he brings his family in and they settle down, they're settling down in a good way. They're settling down with a lot of grace and favour. Then it's just a generation later when I suppose it's like me saying to you, hey, my granddad was a really good friend of your granddad. So can I borrow some money?
Yeah.
What would you say?
Yeah, that would be unusual. Yeah.
You'd say, huh?
Yeah.
and it wouldn't mean a thing.
Yeah.
And I think this is the situation that Israel's family has ended up in the people who got on well were their granddads. And these people now just seem like a pain to the Egyptians. So without the relationship, they're just saying, what should we do about this problem?
The people writing this are telling a story with a purpose in mind. And I think that's really fascinating.
Yes. Now, I think the person telling the story has made a really good choice here. Knowing how good relationships are and knowing how important relationships are to us, we get a relationship to follow through this story. We get introduced to Moses.
Right. It's not abstract. It's personal. Moses is an Israelite. He's a descendant of Abraham. And he is adopted into Pharaoh's family. He actually is adopted as Pharaoh's grandson because it's Pharaoh's daughter that adopts him. And I find that quite fascinating because for me it's about, he actually finds himself within a very close relationship with Pharaoh himself. So when we hear about the conversations with Pharaoh, this is not some abstract person that's just appeared out of nowhere that's a bit of an opposition character to the leadership of Pharaoh or the kingship of Pharaoh. This is one of his adopted family. And I find that absolutely fascinating. Just imagine what Pharaoh must have thought. What is going on? My grandson is doing. What's he doing?
It's very important that we have Moses to be able to relate to. And I love how, almost like from the very beginning of Moses' story, there are echoes of the other stories in Genesis. There's a detail that a Jewish scholar pointed out that I found that I'd never really spotted before. In verse 2 of chapter 2, the woman becomes pregnant, gives birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, is how it says in the NIV.
Yeah.
Now, the word for fine is the same word that's used in Genesis 1 for good.
Ah, right. Yeah.
So Moses comes along and she sees that he is good.
Yeah. Ooh. And what word did you use for that the other day? Was it ordered?
There's lots of thought about what that word means. The word is tov, as in mazel tov.
Yeah.
Like good luck. But tov has a huge amount of meaning. The same way that the English word good has a massive amount of different meanings. The resonances include a kind of divine order, a kind of thing that God would like to happen. Yeah. It's not the same as perfection. It's not the same as this is all finished and done. It's more like this has potential. This can go somewhere. This is in the direction that life wants to go, basically, and a good direction. Yeah. If you contrast life and death and order and decay, you have these contrasting terms of Tov, and Ra would be the other word that goes with it. Ra would mean evil, or it would mean decay or opposition to good. And the story that's being told actually through this account with Moses is that he comes along and he's given and he's good, but he has this meeting with evil. And in fact, lots of encounters really with evil in different kinds. And the one that we're going to look forward to will be the big, massive, dramatic encounter with Pharaoh. But before then, I would say, you can already see the influence of Ra, of evil, in good Moses. Because what does he do? Is he a perfect person? Is he God's, perfect saviour that he sent to save the Egyptians? Well, he's going to do a lot of saving. There's saving that's going to come through him, but he's also a murderer. And people find that out early on. There's no way of saying that Moses was perfect, that he's an ideal role model. The storyteller wants us to know that he's come from a good place, that he's encountered evil, and he's faced it in a way that people might often face it, like lashing out and being a bit overprotective. And he's been caught out for that as well. And that could have threatened his relationships. And because of that guy who comes up to Moses who says, "What, are you going to judge us? Are you going to kill us like you did that Egyptian?" And Moses goes, "Uh-oh, busted."
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, he understands the gravitas of what he's done, doesn't he?
Absolutely. So it's not like an abstract, out of nowhere, good versus evil, Clash of the Titans thing.
No.
It's interesting because it is a family story. It's within a family that all this is happening.
Yeah.
And my take on this is that we find this battle everywhere, not just between good people and evil people, but within ourselves.
Yeah.
Within, what's the closest you can have that's even closer than family? It's you, right?
Yeah, right.
And Moses has to deal with his own struggles, as we do. He has to make his own choices, as we do.
Yeah.
If we wind back to Genesis again, and the story of how people grabbed the thing that God didn't necessarily want us to have, which is the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
The fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
There's an Egyptian word, apparently, evil good.
Oh.
And when evil good is put together, the sense that scholars think that means is it just meant everything, a wide-ranging, everything amount of stuff.
Mm.
So part of the Egyptian culture that Israel's family was immersed in for a long time has this concept of evil good.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily saying that that's a moral evil and a moral good, like good choices and bad choices, but it's actually a much more kind of cosmic kind of recognition that there is life and death, that there are things that are ordered and there are things that decay.
Yeah. And
so we're part of this world, this universe that has evil good. And what you want for your kids is just good, right? If you had the choice, you'd say, "Oh, my child is good. I only want good in their life. Let's surround them with goodness and good relationships." And then you have to deal with, ultimately with the fact that, well, we also have rotten things happen, and we're also facing evil, and we're also facing challenge to what we'd like. And so that comes through in all these stories about how we're part of a world which is evil good. And the way that the Israelites want to deal with that is to cling on to their origins in good. So this and our God has ordered us to be good, and ordered in every sense, like not just told us, but created this order in which goodness can flourish, and that should happen.
But I think that's really insightful. And I think that two things I wanted just to say. One is that I think you're right, and there's an exposition of this to some extent in the conversation between Moses and Pharaoh, where the narrator talks about Pharaoh hardening his own heart, and yet also God hardening Pharaoh's heart. So there's this both and approach here, where it's like, because often we struggle with that, don't we, in general life? We're like, well, if God is all powerful, why does he let evil happen? And we go, well, evil does happen, but it's also a choice as well. of the individual, right? And so in our lives, as you said, we're struggling. We will all struggle with evil and good in our own lives. In our city at the moment, we're struggling with evil and good. We've had some terrible murders of children. I think 6 children have been murdered in our city in the last 2 weeks. And of course, globally, we're seeing awful atrocities across the Middle East and in Ukraine and Russia at the moment. So there's so much that challenges our sense of good and evil, and how do we deal with that? And I think that, when we look at this story of Moses and Pharaoh, and we reflect on this story which is occurring within an empire, the Israelites are being oppressed by the Egyptian empire. What we're reading is the Hebrew Bible, which was largely compiled around the time when the Israelites were once again living under the oppression of another empire, this time the Babylonian Empire, about 500 years before Jesus. And they're living in captivity in what we now call Basra or Baghdad, that sort of area, this sort of area between the Tigris and the Euphrates in modern day Iraq. But back then it was the Babylonian Empire, and they were living under the oppression of this empire that had conquered them, destroyed their city, destroyed their temple, and then carried them off, well, not all of them, but certainly the aristocracy, into exile in Babylon. So they're writing this at a time when they're living under the oppression of another empire, and they're writing about the story of how their ancestors, their forebears, were also living under the oppression of another empire. And I'm sure they're dealing with all of the evil that they have experienced at the hands of the Babylonians. So it's just a fascinating insight as they tell this story. And I think it is what they're telling. One of the reasons they're telling this story to their children and their grandchildren is they're telling a story that, not to ruin the story, but that God will rescue them from their captors, because God has rescued them previously from the captivity of the Egyptian empire. So I find that fascinating, the whole backdrop to that.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's a very good example of a very specific resonance that this story had with people in a very specific situation, but also bigger. This is an important origin story.
Yes.
That Jewish people today recognise as the foundational story for themselves as a nation. This is how we know we are this thing. So that's really important. And I guess one of the things that glues them together, apart from just having declared that, is being a family.
Yeah.
But then the question is, well, what makes them distinctive? The discussion that Pharaoh and Moses was having, I think, reveals a lot of this. Yeah. Like a lot of the sort of the motivation, if you like, for wanting to make a difference. Moses strikes me going into this not perfect. He's full of doubt. And God, it says in the story, reassured him, not just with words, but with signs, with power, with miracles, things that he could do, that he could point to, so people would go, yeah, that's probably God doing that, or a God doing that. In the Egyptians' minds, there were loads of gods. And as with all ancient peoples, gods was a convenient way or a sensible looking way of describing things that you couldn't understand. How come the sun rises and the sun sets? Well, we don't do that. A god probably does that. And Egypt had Ra, the sun god. Yeah. So what we have between Pharaoh and Moses is a good old-fashioned ding-dong between gods.
Yes.
And looking at whose God is strongest, whose God is the greatest. And that's one fairly obvious way to read this story. Yeah. That they sort of have these sort of challenges for each other. And what intrigues me is how Pharaoh goes away, and even the rotten things like turning water to blood that will kind of poison people and make people suffer. Pharaoh goes, well, I can do that. I've got my people who can do that for me. And so every time Moses in the beginning comes up with a sign, Pharaoh's first reaction is, well, can I do that? Can I explain that some other way? Is there some other way that I can come up with to do that thing? And then I won't believe that it's God doing that. And I think we're also tempted sometimes to only recognise that it's God doing something when we can't explain it any other way. And I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think sometimes we need stories like that. We need things like that in our lives to grab our attention and make us think, oh, actually, I think God's real. For me, a lot of those things happened when I was a teenager. And I was in a family where we were really struggling for money, and we got evicted from our house, and we didn't know what we were going to do.
Yeah.
And we prayed, and miraculous things happened, like exact amounts of money that we needed came through the door.
Wow.
Just an electricity bill that we had. We'd read the meter. We knew what the bill was. We knew what we had to pay. It came back from the electric company that actually they wanted to give us money instead. What's going on? And to me, through my eyes of faith and wanting to spot signs of God at work, I credited that to God and going, I can't explain this any other way. I'm very convinced in my head that God is real and does amazing things. There's been lots of things. Yeah, I've since then been in places and seen people healed or given words to people in languages that I don't understand, but they've received. And they've had conversations with God in their heads that I knew nothing about, but they heard me saying something and they credited that to God. It's all stuff that's like way beyond our understanding. Now, here's the thing. Does God only live in the places where we don't understand, where we don't have another explanation? I think that's one of the modern challenges to belief in God, because we've got science. And there's loads of other things we can do that we say, oh, well, we can understand. We don't need to believe in a sun god anymore because we understand physics. Thanks. Just Newtonian physics and how things kind of, will rotate. That gives us a clue. And now we understand lots more physics. And now we understand like how fusion powers the sun and gives all the energy. Brilliant. Does that mean we don't need God anymore? And for some people, I think, yeah, it kind of does. And I don't think that's necessarily just for other people. I think even for me, sometimes my faith can end up hooked to the things that I can't explain any other way. But the God of the Israelites, I think, is inspiring these stories to tell us something else, which is that he's not just the God of a people and a God of things that can't be understood, but he's the God of everything. He's the God of everything, including the things that we think we do understand and the things that we want to build our lives on, the relationships that we want to build our lives on, the love that we think is entirely our choice to give or not to give. What's not to understand about that? Well, if God's the God of love and the source of love for us, then actually what we're looking at, I think, in the Bible generally isn't a collection of stories that just go, here's how you know God's real because of all this stuff that happens that you couldn't explain any other way. What you're looking at is stories that show God as the foundation of everything for us. And the invitation is to be like Moses and to go with God in the everything. It's also a challenge, though, because you look at God's involvement and you see these things that, like, what do you mean God hardened Pharaoh's heart? What does that mean? God made Pharaoh do awful things. God precipitated this situation where loads of people would die. Isn't God horrible? Yeah, that's a legit way of asking questions about this passage, because it's a difficult thing. But I think maybe the people putting this together weren't just processing what was different and special about their God. I think they were processing and recognizing God as the God of everything. And so if they were going to give God the credit for the good things and the life and the pulling them out of slavery, they also were quick to see that God was still involved in the heart of Pharaoh, that God was not absent from the heart of Pharaoh, that God was involved and somehow what he wanted came to pass through this story. And so he's the God that isn't just in the places where we don't understand.
Yeah, that's great, Bern, isn't it? And I think that in our Western culture, and if you're listening to this from a culture that's not part of Western Europe or North America, or I think that I'm just reminded that we have a secular culture in the West which decides that asserts rather that it remains independent of any religious story or any religious tradition, and I think that's just not true. And I think that some of the ideas that you've just talked about there, some of those philosophical ideas about embracing good and evil and understanding that they're part of our common experience together, is very much a Western principle. We recognise it and acknowledge it, but it actually finds its roots in this sort of story. This is where we find it. This is where it comes from. Is that right?
I think so. No, I'm also reflecting back on what I just said and thinking, you could misunderstand me here and think that I was being so universalist that I would say that God is also the source of evil as well as the source of good. I don't believe that. I think these stories.
I don't think we heard you say that, but you're right. Yeah, it's good to say that.
I think it's important to kind of make the distinction here that these stories are told for a very specific purpose, which is, yes, you recognise good and evil everywhere in the world. Yes, you recognise order and chaos, order and disorder. The Egyptians, by the way, very, very into order. That was, they wanted their own way of ordering things.
Yeah.
That was entirely their gig. But to have the kind of order that God wanted for people, I think this is what's coming through this story, is that you'll see it. You'll see the kind of fruit that it bears. It looks like Moses as a young child, saw baby Moses and he was good. It looks like life when you see it's full of potential and you can imagine all the best things for it. And that it's going to grow and that it's going to develop. That's the kind of good that God invests in. We just happen to also be in a world where that good doesn't always get its way.
Yeah.
And part of the whole sort of reason for the Bible existing is to try and navigate us through the reasons for that, or just how to deal with the clashes. And one of the things then that's going to come up is on a much more mundane level than, let my people go and let's see, have dramatic, miraculous things happen. The more mundane level of how do I make choices in everyday life? How do I choose good things? And we're going to get on to the subject of rules and guidelines and wisdom and ways of finding good in the world in everyday ways, which Moses starts to get onto at Mount Sinai. But I think we probably need to come back to that next time.
Yeah, that's a much longer conversation, isn't it? But Bern, I was talking in episode 3 of Building a Community of Hope, which is my current box set series looking at the book of Acts. And in Acts 2, which we are looking at an event that as Christians we call Pentecost, but it's actually a Jewish festival, Pentecost. And it's actually exactly this moment on Mount Sinai that we're just referring to then, that we're reading about in what would it be, Exodus 19 onwards. This is the event that's being celebrated by the Jews in Jerusalem in Acts 2. So if you've been listening to that box set series, then just a referral point that this is the event that we're talking about, and it's about where God's presence is with his people, and that's something else that you can be listening to this week if you'd like to as you continue, because next week we're going to be listening to the second half of Exodus. We very much hope that you can join us in that, and we'll be talking about that next week.
See you then.
Bye bye.